So, a couple of weeks ago, I prefaced a sermon with a story of a confrontation I had with a gentleman in England. And he had really accosted somebody who was clearly a fairly aged gentleman who was complaining that life was just too difficult to handle. He was obviously suffering from depression, and he also had a number of aches and pains and challenges in life. And this particular gentleman chose to really spiritually abuse him in that situation by chastening him for not having enough faith. The leading question being, what can a doctor do for you that God can't do? Which is, of course, is a canard, is a false argument, because God is all powerful and can do everything, and obviously a doctor can do very, very little. But that doesn't mean to say that he can't offer some help any more than the fact that God is the ultimate friend. On the other hand, you're supposed to also be comforting and friendly. And you're never going to measure up to the capacity that God has or his ability to strengthen and encourage another person. So arguments like that just go nowhere. But on the other hand, as I talked about the doctrine of healing, we could pose the question in our lives when we run up against difficulties, since God is all powerful, what's he up to in this particular phase in my life, this passage in my life? I told you the very personal story of being told that my wife was gone, dead. And 3-4 days later, she came out of the coma and was granted 8 months extension to her. Extremely important for her children, for certain things that she accomplished, but also begged the question, if you're going to work out 8 months, what about 8 years? I mean, is your hand shortened that you cannot save? Are your promises sort of small promises? If you're going to get into the miracle business, why don't you get into it instead of doing these half-baked things? Like as I'm driving and it's February and the road is covered in black ice and it's 11 o'clock at night and I'm on the way back from doing the Lord's work late at night, going along rather foolishly with cruise control on, and realize them as going up an incline that there are logging trucks coming towards me, 2 of them. And I think, well, I'll just take my foot off the gas, and hey, I'm slipping here, and I'm starting to fishtail. And literally, I'm turning sideways and looking at this truck coming towards me and asking myself, well, I've got a distance, I'll just steer into the skid. And as I steer into the skid, I realize nothing is happening as it should. Then I realize I'm stuck on cruise control, so I hit the brake, but it's too late. And I feel this truck blasting past me. And then I continue to fishtail in front of the next oncoming logging truck. And my life flashes before my eyes, and somehow I fishtail again back into the correct line. And another truck goes, combination of, aren't I a good driver? And isn't the Lord good? And as I fishtail again, I think, wow, I'm leading a charmed life, isn't it? And I go into a ditch and I plow directly into a rock cliff and crunch up the front of my brand new Buick station wagon. It was a beautiful one too, it's blue. I'll never forget that wagon because I didn't drive it for the next 3 months. Because we can't fix it, it's new, and it's going to take a while to get parts. And I literally borrowed an old pickup truck from a friend and drove that, and it was kind of embarrassing. And then somebody else loaned me a car for a week, and I was too embarrassed to just say, somebody, to the boss, if I just rented a car for a couple of months, because, hey, idiot, you're the one who smacked the car up. You can cope with the embarrassment and the inconvenience. And so I coped for 3 months with that, thinking, what's God up to? If he could rescue me from 2 logging trucks and bail me out of a stupid situation like that, why couldn't he stop me just a couple of feet short of that rock face? Well, he didn't, and I suffered the embarrassment, which it was a lot easier to suffer than getting squished into oblivion, which would have been the case. You know, the driving story is a little bit funny. The other one, not so much. But they were both incredible miracles, but they were, if you will, small mercies, for which I would have been more grateful for large mercies. Well, you know how human beings are. When you're a young woman and you're widowed and you're left with a couple of kids and very little money, and you have to raise your children, the difficulties and the problems that you face, and maybe there are simple little answers to prayer, but there's no big answer. And you wonder, well, what is God up to? If he's going to answer prayers, why doesn't he answer the important ones? When you find yourself flogging through a horrible marriage. And I remember one lady saying this to me. She was a renter in Unit 2B, and off into a stupid situation, frankly, and she had a child with somebody she thought was going to be working out fine, and he turned out to be a guy who had zero ambition when it came to leaving the house and getting work. And she commented, rather droll manner, because I had gone there to look at something and do something for her, and she'd been a very diligent person. She ran a daycare home in the unit. And I said, okay, so obviously he's not living with you, whatever happened? And she said, well, he turned out just to be a sperm donor. And that was it. And there was obviously some hurt and some damage and some sadness. And I think she had a certain measure of faith, but she also had a certain measure of foolishness, obviously, in the situation she was in. But she managed to have 3 children, and I think by 3 different men. And I think she probably had all sorts of expectations of how life would be and what God would do for her. But she found herself in a tough situation. And to her credit, she finally left that situation, went to school, and I hope she's doing well now. I have no knowledge of how her life has continued. But I'm sure she wanted certain miracles. She was grateful for her children, but that was about all that she was grateful for in life, and could be grateful for, frankly. As you look at life and its unevenness and its challenge, especially as Christians, especially as people of faith, especially as people who read the stories about spectacular healings, miracles, and deliverance, realize that there are small mercies in our lives, but nothing that you can write to the Edmonton Journal about and say, look how God raised this person to life again, because there will be an explanation. People fall asleep, people wake up. Look how God saved me from a horribly, think of the chaos and the hurt that I would have left behind if I had died in that traffic accident. Well, stuff happens. It's winter, and somebody would find an explanation for that. I have my explanation, and I know where my experience lies, but it's difficult to communicate that through an article in the newspaper or through an essay in a journal or something like that. But it's true. It's true to me. The Bible is the book of Job. And Job, we are told, went through some tough times. Now, I personally believe that there was a man called Job, and I think his experience was real. You have to understand when you come to the book of Job, though, it's a report of something that happened, and it's clearly structured to appeal to the Hebrew mind, 3 comforters, 3 cycles of discussion. You know that life doesn't really happen that way, where one person gives a monologue, and then the other person gives a monologue, and then the second person gives a monologue, things like that. And so you find these cycles in the book, and it's written and structured in a way to teach in a Hebrew context. But the truth of the matter is that as Job went through his experience where everything, it was stripped from him. It tells us in Job chapter 1 and verse 20, after he'd heard all the bad news, your kids have just died, your riches have just evaporated, and there are problems and difficulties coming your way. it says, did this. At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Now, those were signs of grief and agony and pain in that culture and in that time. I doubt if very many of us have just literally torn our clothes to express our grief. And many of us wouldn't have to shave our head anyway, that sort of thing. But here you have, you chuckle, you're not in that great a shape, James. But here the point is, these were symbolic gestures that spoke to a mourning in humility. And so it says he did these things. Then he fell on the ground in worship and said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." An interesting reaction. But it says very specifically that Job was a righteous man. He did that which was right. And so his response was a rightness. In all this, we are told, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. He didn't say God is weak, God is feeble, God is untrustworthy. There were a lot of other things that said around him, but Job maintained his rightness. And in this, he recognized that life was not even, it was not fair. Life was not set in a garden, in a paradise. Life is in fact set outside of a paradise, in a world where weeds grow, where fair effort is not rewarded, where disaster is not distributed evenly among us all. He simply accepted that the response in all of his experience was, first of all, to acknowledge God. His wife, in her distress, said, "Look, this is horrible. Look at you sitting on a pile of ash in mourning, scraping yourself because your body hurts," which is what happened then. And trying to understand what was going on. And the funny thing is, he did not sin and charge God with wrongdoing, it says, whereas we know the backstory on this. This was God's doing. He allowed this to happen. Now, God tells us in Isaiah chapter 45 and verse 7, "I form the light and create darkness. I bring prosperity and create disaster. I, the Lord, do all these things." Now, you can read that and you can say, well, do you mean that God is actively involved in doing? Well, at one particular point, he says to Israel, things will go wrong if you go against me. But what you're reading here is, and in the King James, it says more specifically, "I form the light, create the darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do things." Does God really, quote, create evil? Well, by allowing free will, he allows evil. So since he is the creator of all things, he has created the potential. He does not do evil, but he allows for evil to be done. This is a very uneven world. We're right now going through sort of a lot of public examination, a lot of misbehavior, a lot of sin is being revealed from the past. And a lot of women who are finding the courage to step forward and say, this happened to me. And these things were very real and very tragic. A couple of people I happen to like. I like Bill O'Reilly. He's a conservative. Enjoyed his particular commentaries. But I've also known what we would call in England, Bill O'Reilly was a dirty old man. And the reason I know that is because I've heard his taped messages to women that he left on their answering machine that women shared with the public, 10 and 12 years ago. And so I know there's a culture that he worked in where it was acceptable for a long time to blame or rather be vulgar or be overly overbearing to women. And I know how that culture works, and I know that we all sort of degenerate to the lowest common denominator. I learned that lesson when I got out of college in an interesting way. At the time, I was working in an editorial department. There were a lot of open desks remember that. And the head of the department at the time, Paul Kroll, hired one of my classmates, Marilyn Williams, as the secretary / administrator for the department. Now, Marilyn was a very smart woman. She ended up marrying Sam Kneller, learned French, assisted in ministry in France. I mean, she was a sharp woman. She was a straight A student. I'm guessing perhaps, but I imagine she was a straight A student. And how can I put it? I wasn't. Okay? So let's just put that in perspective. But here she sat at a sort of a work area, and she was kind of the administrator, secretary, manager, and there were 2 or 3 other fellows a little older than me who were senior staff writers on the Plain Truth at the time. And I never forget Marilyn got up from her desk and went to get some coffee or do something like that, and they just all said, "Hey, if you're going, babe, here's my cup too." And the next guy held his cup and said, "Hey, Marilyn, if you're going, here's my cup too." And guess who the third idiot was that held up his cup and waved it? You know, hey, you're a woman, you're going to the coffee pot. We're guys. This is something a woman does, right? You know? Well, a couple of days later, there was just a general memo circulated basically saying, and you could read between the lines what Paul Kroll wrote. We have a department secretary now. He might as well just have written in, she's smarter than all 3 or 4 or 5 or 8 of you put together. You might want us to remember that she's not hired to get coffee for you. And it was very specifically spelled out in there. She's not here to serve coffee. In other words, don't you guys ever do that again. But I was an idiot, Now, if you happen to be in an environment, as Bill O'Reilly was quoted as saying, that where Roger Ailes, seriously proposed to a woman making millions of dollars a year, that if you want to be mentored and sponsored and promoted further, well, you need to spend a little social time away from the office with me at a hotel. The quotable quotes I read was, hey, if you want to play with the big boys, you got to lay with the big boys. That's the cultural environment, you see. Now, when Bill went on television and complained, that he was having a very bad time, which was true, and he was deeply hurt and embarrassed, the next question for the interviewer was, "Are you mad at God?" He said, "Yeah, I'm mad at God. I'm mad at God. And one day I'm going to see him and I'm going to ask, why did you let this happen to me?" And I could almost hear God saying in response, "Bill, have you ever heard of free will? Have you ever heard of free will? Have you ever heard of, you heard the stories, you read the book, you wrote novels and accounts based on the book. Have you ever heard of free will? It's big in Catholic theology, and you're big on Catholic Catholicism. You kind of, I create evil. How? I let you do what you want to do." Another guy across the aisle, you might say, is Al Franken. Al Franken apparently did a lot of good things over the last few years. A lot of people respect him in the Senate. But this last week, a rather vulgar picture surfaced. And what does it picture him doing? You could say just being goofy. But the consequences, working as a comedian as he did, around a lot of people, and some of his peers died of drug abuse and so forth. And none of the humor was, they ever shy back. And so once again, things done back at a time when you lived down to the lowest common denominator, it's kind of embarrassing now because he's apparently been a very, very faithful husband and seen his wife through some very difficult times with drug dependency and so forth. And apparently he's a wonderful husband and a wonderful grandfather, but, some of these things come back to bite you. And these are times when, rightly so, people are asking the question, should we act in these ways? And the answer is no, we never should have. And so there's a lot of things that are being discussed, and a lot of people find themselves on the griddle. And they're all things done under free will. And so, yes, evil happens. Through all of this, one of the most helpful sermons perhaps I ever heard was, in fact, I didn't actually hear the sermon, I just heard the title and the gist of the sermon by Dr. Herman Hay. He simply put it this way. He said, I hold God responsible. Because ultimately God takes responsibility and charge of all things in this life and works them out, which brings me back around to this point. Despite the fact that we say evil happens, yes, God has created the opportunity for us to choose life or to choose things that don't work very well with life and perhaps contribute towards even our own death. And we're all subject to that. And as I said, I learned that and didn't stop me, saying inappropriate things or at times doing inappropriate things or stupid things. But I learned in a hurry from those things. And I learned also that, free will calls upon us to be considerate. I told this story many years ago of the time I came to church, and this was quite a few years ago now, many, many years ago, but I complimented Mrs. Schultz on a very sort of orange-brownish blazer she was wearing. Hey, that looks very nice. And she, in turn, shared the compliment with my wife, who informed me when I got home that she had the identical blazer that I'd never noticed. Little things like that sort of clue you in that you might want to be aware of your circumstances surrounding. Things are inappropriate. If you're going to compliment anybody, make sure you complimented your wife. If you're going to, I was trying to do something well the other day, and somebody said, be careful, Bob. You start with a high standard, you might have to keep it up for the rest of your married life. And I thought, this has to be thought of. And I've been reminded of a couple of things, interestingly enough, of late. But in certain cultures, certain things are appropriate and not. Some people hug you when they meet, but, you just don't rush up to every lady you meet and hug them. I noticed some years ago I had the pleasure of flying on Ethiopian Airlines. And it was a very, very long flight from South Africa home, and so there were two crews. And as they entered the aircraft, the senior captain stood there, and all the hostesses, all of the cabin attendants who came on were very pleased, and they all came to the captain, and they all kissed him on left cheek, right cheek, left cheek. You wouldn't necessarily kiss him, but 1, 2, 3. I thought that it's either very French or very something, but we don't conduct ourselves in quite that way. It'd be very inappropriate if I stood at the door and whoever came in, I just, bust them on each cheek once or twice. Paul speaks about that which is greet each other with a holy kiss. Well, I'll tell you something, I'm glad to see Jim, but he didn't get no kiss from me today. That's as simple as that, things like that. And so, Here I'm talking about certain topics that are a little bit, and I've wasted too much time on this, but evil happens, and you have to realize that sometimes things are just not appropriate for certain cultural circumstances. Now, coming all the way back to the subject of things that go wrong and what we want out of life, discussions go to this, and I've heard the accusation leveled against our congregation. If you had more faith, you'd see more healings. Or if you had more faith, you'd see more miracles. And then it slips to, and I've had, again, this discussion where it becomes, you have to have an expectancy before you receive. Now, there are two factors involved here. There's what we call faith, all right? And then there's what we call PMA. Which is positive mental attitude. Now, am I all big on faith? Absolutely. It calls for me to place my confidence in a subject that is capable of responding to me. And I place my faith in Jesus Christ and what I know to be His promises. All right? Now, positive mental attitude is another particular frame of mind. We could appeal to scriptures where Paul will say things like, whatsoever things are just and pure and good, think on these things, all right? But can we limit God by our lack of expectancy. Now, I look at this in the context of Israel's experience with God. You know, they came up to the promised land, and they didn't have faith in God. And they didn't express confidence, and they groaned, and they said, wow, this is all too much. So God said, okay, I'll let all of you wander in the wilderness until you all die off, and then I'll give the idea on to your kids, see if they're ready for this. And in Psalm 78, you read this commentary on the experience between God and Israel. It says, for their heart was not right with him, neither were they steadfast in his covenant. But he, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity and destroyed them not. Yea, many a time turned he his anger away and did not stir up all his wrath. For he remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passes away and comes not again. How often did they reproach him in the wilderness and grieve him in the desert? Yea, they turned back and tempted and limited the Holy One of Israel. Now, can I limit God? And the answer is yes, I can. I can be negative. I can be grumpy. I can be, God created my life for me to experience a certain measure of joy and enthusiasm. And no matter what the circumstances, I can enter into a very positive relationship with God. But here it says, and I never forgot this reference, which is why I looked it up and wanted to share it, that they were the ones who limited the Holy One of Israel. How? Well, they didn't reflect on his power, his hand, nor the day when he delivered them from the enemy, how he had worked his signs in Egypt, wonders in the field of Zoan, and had turned their rivers into blood and their floods that they could not drink. So how did they limit God? They refused to look at his promises. Even more to the point, they refused to look at the track record where God had worked things out for them. And so am I big on positive mental attitude? Yes, absolutely. I don't pray with the idea that, well, you're probably not listening anyway, but I got to put the time in. I don't pray with the thought that, well, maybe you will, maybe you will. I don't limit God. On the other hand, unbounded enthusiasm will not bring me all I want. I can look, I don't know if you ever do this, but every time I schlep out a superstore, there's always this sign that says Max or something. This week, 88 million. And as I'm leaving, it tempts me to buy a ticket, which I've never done. I can't even understand the things. I occasionally get them in birthday cards, and I have to ask Adam, could you scratch it off and explain it to me? That's how much of a gambler I am. And in fact, every time I schlep out, I think, well, what would I do with $80 million? And then I ruin the walk from the store to the truck where I put the groceries in by thinking, well, maybe this, maybe that. And that's why eventually I've quit and gone to Costco, because they don't offer that. And so I'm not tempted to speculate as to what 80 million would do to me. But I'm sure if I ever got 80 million, all of you would have suggestions, right? Yeah. All of you would help me out. But this idea that unbounded enthusiasm, one guy who won a potload was interviewed, and he said, I have had this feeling coming on for the last year. Well, how many people, okay, worked for you, buddy, you're one in a million, you're one in a billion, but how many people have had that feeling coming on and just it didn't, that point of view. I gambled once. I was a junior in college, and it was the festival season, and I went to South Shore Lake Tahoe, and I played the roulette wheel. And within 2 minutes, I was $5 shorter. And you know something? I felt so bitter and negative about that, I'd never gambled again. All right? And so I don't believe that just positive expectancy will get God to give me all that I want, or even all that I necessarily might believe. But I do know that in my relationship with God, it's like a relationship, well, it's a partnership, isn't it? And if you think about it, those of you who are married, what builds a partnership? What builds a marriage? Well, chances are you look back on a series of small but very much appreciated gestures. a series of small, you could probably save some time if you didn't put it in the sink, but directly in the dishwasher. Really? Well, it never occurred to me, Well, it did occur to me, but I was too lazy to do it, this sort of thing. And so you change, you moderate, and you harmonize certain things in your life, and you do not treat your other partner as an ATM. God is not an ATM. Card in, and you get out what you request. It just doesn't work that way. On the other hand, when you enter into a relationship, you do thank the other person for small mercies, for tender mercies, for moments of consideration, for noticing this or noticing that. And that is a relationship with God, which is why I titled the sermon in appreciation for small mercies, because God is not constantly delivering on huge things. He's delivered on one huge thing. And that is, do you like life? Yes. Well, I'll tell you what, I will see you through and make you whole and grant you everlasting life. But before you can appreciate everlasting, you're going to have to live through the process of understanding this life. And I'm going to let you make mistakes, and I'm going to let you blunder, and I'm going to let you fall, and I'm going to let you hurt. And sometimes when you're going to hurt too much for my purposes, I will make sure the truck doesn't smash you into oblivion. I will make sure that you were brought back from death. I will spare you the consequences of perhaps a really huge mistake by interrupting your stupidly destructive plan of action. I will do these things. And as we look at I look into the life of Paul, and I see this, again, small mercies. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, and Paul had a lot of trouble with the Corinthian church. They were not particularly nice to him at times. They were very critical. Said of him that he was just not impressive. The Greeks liked impressive, individuals, tall, dark, and handsome, well cut. Guys who could take all their clothes off and look good running a race or throwing a javelin. That was the Greek mentality. Of Paul, it was said he was short, he was bald, he was stooped. Well, my idea of masculinity. Well, this sort of thing. He was not impressive, and he was not an orator either. Oh, he spoke, but, well, his writings, they said, are heavy and significant and authoritative. But in person, he is, to quote the Corinthians, weak and contemptible. And that was the word, little squirt. If they knew the word Napoleon complex, they may have used that in a derogatory way. All right, he preached the gospel to us, but we like Apollos. Apollos is 6 inches taller, got all his hair, and when he speaks, he is magnificent. That's Apollos for you. Paul, little squirt. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. This, he says, is the gift that God has given you. But we have this treasure in jars of clay. We are made of clay, he said. He might just well have said mud. To show all surpassing power is from God, not from us. We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. Now that doesn't sound like the formula you signed up for, does it? In your mind, wow, to be whole spiritually, that's good, but I want to be whole physically. I don't want stress. I was talking to somebody this morning who was complaining, I'm just not going anywhere. I go to work, I pay bills, and I can't even pay all of them. And I'm kind of, and the best I could say was, look, put your nose down, put your tail up, and work day by day by day by day. Just put one step in front of another, and thank God that you have food and that you have a roof over your head. You got a wife who loves you, and you got a child or two. Just start from that perspective. But you have big dreams, But just living day by day in warmth and in comfort, it's not satisfying you right now because you're looking at, and so he says, look, okay, there are difficulties and stresses, but I do not confess to being crushed in despair. I don't believe I'm abandoned. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be in our mortal body. In a rough translation, life sometimes challenges and hurts. And yes, we're growing older and we're decaying and we are built of very temporary materials. But he says, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you. That's the perspective you need to take. It is written, I believed, therefore I have spoken. Since we have that same spirit of faith, we also believe and therefore speak, because we know that the one who raised the Lord Jesus from the dead will also raise us with Jesus and present us with you to himself. You read those words and you want them to mean something in James. He will raise you up. Well, what does it mean? Well, you can take it very simply. Well, I will be just snapped out of it and brought back. And if you had enough faith, that would be the way it is. But here Paul is saying, in the midst of difficulties, I have been raised up. All this is for your benefit, so that the grace that is reaching more and more people may cause thanksgiving to overflow to the glory of God. Therefore, do not lose heart. Though outwardly we're wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles. Now, I don't think you can look at being widowed, being afflicted with a disease that may eventually take your life. It's just light and it is momentary. But from an eternal perspective, Paul encourages us to look and say, okay, this too will pass. And there is a deliverance on the horizon. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Now that's kind of a conundrum, isn't it? How can you fix your eyes on what is unseen? Well, he's talking spiritually. We have to raise our vision. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Can it look like defeat and still be a victory in God's eyes? Actually, yes. Because he is writing the story and he will cause it to be victory. A little later in the book of Corinthians, Paul brings up a very touchy subject. The fact that he, if you will, can't even read what he writes. In fact, he can't even read to write, if you will, and so he has to have a minusis. When he lives in Corinth, he actually writes a letter to the Romans, and this brilliant treatise, which has come down through 2,000 years, and literary students read it, others read it, and his words have shaped Western civilization. And he couldn't even set pen to paper. He thought it, and then he had to speak it to somebody for him. And so he says, lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of revelations, because he had seen visions, he'd done miracles. There was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. Now, traditionally, this is understood to be his poor eyesight, which probably was deeply affected by the fact that he was stoned to death once and was raised to life again. And other times he was beaten and bruised. So that kind of threw a few things off physically. But he says that his eyesight was bad, and I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. Now, in Hebrew, the expression 3 and 7 and 12 are very significant. I believe when he says, I asked God 3 times, he just said, well, I prayed about 3 times. Then I just just had to give up. What he's really saying is, I went the distance. I went completely and totally all in. Dead for 3 days and 3 nights. Totally dead. All right, expressions like this. And so he says, when I asked 3 times, you might interpret it in our language, I really beat that subject to death. I asked and I asked and I asked. But the response came back, my grace is sufficient for you. Look, I've already granted you the miracle. And we sort of understand this, okay, and we will say, look, God's timing is perfect. And perhaps we have a trial and he doesn't take it away. We have a health issue and it stays with us. And we say, well, in the greater scheme of things, God has granted us wholeness and healing in the resurrection, these things. But when it comes down to it, then the subtle thing is, but maybe if you had a more positive attitude, you could sort of move that up a little bit. Maybe if you prayed more, you could move it up a bit. Things like that. Well, I can't think of anybody who had more faith than Paul, more confidence in Paul. He went through hell and high water, literally, and yet still maintained this. And he said, I really pushed and pushed. But the response came back, my grace is sufficient for you. In fact, Paul, in your challenge, my strength is made perfect in your weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Now, I am not of that mind. I am not of a desire to do that. But, well, it gets to be an issue, doesn't it? It gets to be a challenge. As I look at Paul getting to the end of his life, and I realize I have a great deal of quotation today, but I just wanted to give, not my stories, but Paul's story. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, you imagine Paul now old, and he is infirm, and he has been beaten down in some ways, and he's writing this last letter from jail. He's writing it to Timothy, who is at Ephesus, where he is pastoring a church and is the bishop of Asia Minor. A little later, placed by John, the Apostle John. But he writes, and he gives advice to Timothy. And this is both good for ministry, it's good for life. And he writes to him, and remember, this is like a son to him. He says, but you keep your head in all situations, endure hardship. Do the work of an evangelist, discharge all the duties of your ministry. And then he reverts back, and I can imagine him dictating this, and his own feelings and his own situation then come to light. For I am already poured out like a drink offering, and the time of my departure is near. Now, if you describe exhaustion, emotional, physical exhaustion, what do you think of? You feel as though we use the expression, I'm just drained. And that's what he is saying here. I am just drained. I've fought the good fight, finished the race, kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing. Wow. Big picture, big picture, big picture. Do your best to come to me quickly. Why? Because he feels lonely, he feels abandoned, he feels drained, he feels weak. And then it talks about those who surrounded him. For Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, and Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Now, if you know Luke, the author of the gospel, if you know Luke, the faithful companion to Paul in all these journeys, you have to sense that Paul is, it's like writing to your kid and saying, I'm just old, I'm just tired and feeble, only your mother's with me. Bit of a put down, bit of a wrong thing to say. Only Luke is with me. Luke is a pillar of strength. But Paul is so exhausted he can't even express it, which is why he says, Tim, do your best to come to me. Get Mark and bring him with you because he's helpful to me in ministry. Remember the backstory of Mark and Paul? Mark, the guy who went part of the way on the first, exhausted and turned back. And when it was time to go on the second journey, what does Paul say to Barnabas? You're not bringing him again? Well, he's my nephew. Of course I want to bring him. No, you're not. Yes, I am. No, you're not. Yes, I am. And they part their ways. And Barnabas goes and does good work in one area, and Paul does good work in another. But I ain't having nothing to do with that pipsqueak Mark. Talking to Mark, he's not here today. So, Freudian slip. But anyway, no, there's nothing wrong. Mark has other responsibilities as well. But here, you get my point. He rejected Mark as unworthy to be in ministry. And now he has to ask Timothy, bring Mark with you if you would. Because he's the author of the first of the Gospels that circulates. He is of great value to Peter. Okay, couldn't help Paul, but boy, Peter loves him. Everybody knows the name of Mark throughout the church. They know Paul's name too, but they don't think of Mark as some loser. Hey, Mark, man, did you read his book? Yeah, I hope they make that into a movie. He's a powerful individual in his own right now. And even Paul is forced to say, Timothy, if you want to bring Mark, I need his help, please. And then look what else he writes. When you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, and my scrolls, especially the parchments. Why bring my coat? Answer, because I'm cold. And when I'm cold, and this is the way the winters were, by the way, in Italy and Greece. I met a couple in Athens many years ago when I was there at festival time, and they're from Montreal. And they own property in Athens. And they said, well, you probably enjoy winter in Athens and summers in Montreal. And they looked at me and said, no, you spend summers in Athens, you spend winters in Montreal. You're telling me the winters in Montreal are better than they're in Athens? Yeah, it's cold, it's damp, it's miserable. Well, that's the way it was in Rome. And Paul's sitting on the edge of his bed dictating this and saying, by the way, I feel old, I feel tired, the damp is creeping into my armpits. He says, I still am the recipient of God's grace. Alexander the metalsmith did me a great deal of harm. The Lord will pay him for what he's done. You too should be on your guard against him because he strongly opposed our message. At my first defense, no one came to my support, but everyone deserted me. May it not be held against them. Wow, that's pretty negative. Luke was with you, right? Well, I felt very much alone. But the Lord stood at my side and gave me strength so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed and all the Gentiles might hear it. And I was delivered from the lion's mouth. Well, that's a kind of an obscure reference to Nero. I was delivered from this beast. The Lord will rescue me from every evil attack and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. To him be glory forever and ever. Amen. I will be raised up. I have been raised up. But there are many promises still to be delivered. In fact, he adds even after this, he adds another point. Oh, I forgot something. Greet Priscilla and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Erastus, he stayed in Corinth. And I left Trophimus sick in Miletus. Wow, that's an interesting thing to add to a letter. A man who laid hands on people and raised them from the dead said, I left my assistant somewhere because he's sick. And again, one of those little comments, do your best to get here before winter. Do your best to get here. And by the way, Ubulus greets you, and so do Pudens, Linus, Claudia, and all the brothers and sisters. The Lord be with your spirit. Grace be with you all. Wow, you read that and you realize this is a man who is experiencing real life. And real life, from Job to Paul to you and to me, is not lived in a relationship that it is an ATM. But it is lived in a dynamic relationship which is preparing us for a dynamic relationship, which is life everlasting. I'm going to close with one more quote from Paul in Philippians, summarizing again from prison what the bottom line was on his life experience. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. What is the secret? Well, I can get through all of this through Christ who gives me strength. Yeah. And by the way, you Philippians, I don't want to say this too loudly, but it's good for you to share in my troubles. That's his way of saying, I really, really needed you, and you came through. And that's what he said to the Philippian church. And so, do we need each other? Absolutely. Do who cares and we are in a relationship with, who walks with us through these trials and difficulties? Yes. But is there a button that you can press? Well, yes, but no. Are there small mercies? Well, constantly. But, all of us would like to, walk past that kiosk on the way out of Superstore and win the lotto. Boy, the problems we would solve. But God does not give us that. He says to me, my grace is sufficient for you. Now walk through this and remember I'm with you. Don't limit me by forgetting to put your faith and your trust and your confidence in me, but don't depend on me to just answer every prayer the way you do. Yes, there is wholeness, there is healing, there is deliverance at the end of this journey. And sometimes it comes in small mercies along the way. But you're going to have to balance that and live with that in the same way at the very beginning of the story Job did. There is a time to gain, there's a time to lose. In all of this, Job said, I praise God. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, today as we struggle with the realities of our lives, as we meet challenges and difficulties that set us back, as we look at promises and wonder when you will deliver on this one or that one, as we yearn to be made whole, to be healed, we, on the other hand, can reflect on your faithfulness over the years, and we see your hand. We don't always see it, but we see it. We see it in the small mercies that you show us. And we ask you that we can open our hearts to treasure the relationship we have with you, not because you are just one who just gives and gives whatever we ask, but you are one who is with us every step of the way through this journey of life. And again, we thank you for the small mercies, knowing that the great mercy has already been given through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, our Savior, in whose grace we rejoice. And we have to finally admit your grace to us is sufficient for all of our needs. We thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen.